All right, everybody. Thank you guys for joining us on this show. I have not posted in a while, um, which is interesting. I plotted the show, I scripted, I prepped it, and I just had some technical challenges. I thought about doing it with just an audio and submitting, but all in all, we're here, we're back. This is gonna be the second episode of the Akol Dok show. The last show we did. Um, the last time I did the show, I was in the United States. Now I'm back to Africa, South Sudan. So it's interesting. Um, so let's go through. Today we're going to discuss some things. We want to discuss Germany just pledged to give 4 billion euros in green projects to Africa. There's elections in Liberia. And then the East African community just held a summit and they want to go through some stuff. So I think the idea of this show is just somebody who's just second episode. What kind of theme do I want? I've done a lot of analysis. I've done different, moderation, media stuff. I've written. I want this to be commentary and analysis, but also I want to push myself to share my ideas of what I think about a lot of stuff. So I have a very informed view of things. I'm a political science person and economic background, political science, economics. I've worked in government. I've worked in the private sector. So I have a unique perspective I believe I can add, and I've done a lot of contributions. If you can see on my channel, I've spoken quite a bit about Africa on these different platforms, CNBC Africa, RT World. So I just want to use this platform to kind of really share my ideas on different things. So let's get started. So this story is interesting. So Germany just hosted the G20 compact with Africa and also hosted the German Africa Summit in Berlin. So the German chancellor just pledged to invest 4 billion euros until 2030 in green energy projects. That's not a lot of money, but okay. So before I have my thoughts on this. You look at the move by some countries who are pushing Africa to play a role and contribute to climate change. Let's look at some of the data that we have. Africa has 17% of the world's population, but contributes just 4% of the total global carbon emissions. All right. 60% of that 4% comes from three countries: South Africa, Egypt, and Algeria. Okay. Why is that important? That's important because when you talk about, okay, we need to reduce emissions, Africa is not the place to go to ask people to reduce emissions, because if they decide to cut their emissions completely and bring it to zero, this is 4%. Now, if you look at it, Africa accounts for 4% of the global emissions, but is the most effective. According to the International Rescue Committee, of the 10 most vulnerable countries susceptible to facing challenge of climate change, 7 are in Africa. Yet Africa only receives 3% of all global climate financing. So it's a double-end approach where the biggest, so to speak, the biggest person who's going to be affected by climate change is Africa. The country emits the least is Africa. So why 4 billion? You know, once again, let me remind you guys, it's 4 billion from until 2030. So meaning it's not 4 billion at a one go. And it's green projects. So in defining green projects is very obscure. You don't know what is green, what isn't green. And it's a good marketing tactic. So if we're really serious about climate change in Africa, let's discuss. Okay, what does this 4 billion euro investment mean for climate financing in Africa? According to the Climate Policy Initiative, Africa needs 277 billion annually to meet the 230 climate goals. So 4 billion over 7 years is a drop in the ocean to 277 billion annually. I think so. Let's go through it. And then now, many African countries rely on energy. If you look at McKinsey, there's a really good report about African energy McKinsey did. I suggest all you guys check it out. So according to McKinsey, African energy demand in 2040 could be 40% higher than it is today. So these are countries who are capitalistic, believe in free markets, like these European and Western countries. The demand is going to be there. So you cannot force a country and say, well, you need to reduce on, your carbon footprint or your reliance on this dirty energy when this is their economic lifeline. And you're not going to give them money to do that. So you want them to cut their investments. Could be oil and gas, could be mining, to meet the global climate goals, the 2030 climate goals. But this is their economic lifeline. But you're not giving them the necessary finance in order to do that. You're giving them a drop in the ocean. It's preposterous. So instead of pushing for green projects, the EU should be pushing to help African nations impacted by climate change. It should be a smooth transition. And if countries want to stay on stay on natural, how do I say this? They call it dirty, not energy. Fossil fuels, that's a word. Then let them do it. That's their economy, their sovereign states, and let them just even out their carbon footprint. I mean, you have countries in the Middle East, you have countries who have an economy. They build wealth on fossil fuel, planting trees so offset their carbon footprint. So I believe this is a drop in the ocean, and it's other nonsense by the EU to push for climate action in African countries. If you want to be effective with climate action, the focus should be on larger economies. The African continent has the lowest per capita emissions at 1 billion tons, next to South America. South America has 2.5 billion tons. So I think that's what they should be focusing on. And look, let me tell you something. I think about it like you have these summits and these conferences that are targeting Africa happening quite a bit. But many of these things, it's that you should know the needs of the people you want to court. Many of these African countries are being courted by the international community. You recently just had the Saudi Africa Summit. You've had the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. You have the Russia Africa Summit. You've had the China Africa Forum, or is it China Africa kind of summit? It's some forum, but still, as an African, you need to know the demands, and this is why the Eastern countries are more popular in Africa as opposed to the Western countries, because the Eastern countries are seen as that they know Africa more and they know what they can offer Africa on the table. So that's what we got to say on that. We'll leave climate change and we're gonna go to the great country of Liberia. Interesting fact: the capital of Liberia is Monrovia. It's named after the U.S. President James Monroe. So for our viewers, James Monroe was the 5th president of the United States. Yeah, and it was a resettlement program that they started in 1809, where they wanted to resettle people from the United States, and then they want to move them to Africa. That's another story. So, Liberian President George Weah, those of you who are soccer fans, George Weah, he won the Ballon d'Or in 1995. He was defeated by Joseph Boakai, and he conceded. So Joseph Boakai won with a slim margin. He got 50.8% of the votes, and George Weah got 49.1% of the votes. It was the tightest election in 2 decades, but it was also a rematch of the 2017 elections where Weah defeated Boakai. So Joseph Boakai was the vice president under President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf from 2006 to 2018. He was agriculture minister from 1983 to 1985 under President Samuel Doe. I mean, career politician. He has a strong background in politics. I mean, if you a minister in the 1980s, vice president. So he ran in 2017, and was defeated in a runoff by George Weah. So a lot of political analysts felt like he could have defeated George Weah, but he didn't get enough support from his party, the Unity Party, and Elaine Johnson. So basically, that 2017, Elaine Johnson, who was his president, he was the vice president, didn't support him as much as she could have. And so that was a concern that many people had. So that's that. So this, let's go to the significance of this. So when George Weah became president, that was the first democratic transition in 74 years. What do we mean democratic transition? We have to look at what is the background into some of these African countries. Like I always say, Africa is a monolith because every country has unique history. Liberia, from what you guys hear of Liberia, you don't hear positive things because they've had a civil war. They had a coup in the 80s. They had a lot of internal issues. They had Charles Taylor. Uh, Everybody knows about he killed my mom, I killed my pa, but I still vote for him. So when you have a history of a propensity for political violence, and then you have a transition where an incumbent president is defeated and he concedes peacefully to the person who defeated him, you are setting a political precedent that can save lives and develop trust in these institutions for decades. This was the first time since the early 1900s that an incumbent president of Liberia was not re-elected after and served one term. So George Weah wanted to be president. He was defeated, and it wasn't like this was the first time a president was defeated and he conceded. In 2017, when George Weah ran against Joseph Boakai, they were both candidates. The president was Elaine Johnson. Yes, Boakai was the vice president, but they were both. It wasn't an incumbent. But this is an incumbent being defeated and conceding without political violence, without nonsense, without pressure from ECOWAS, without pressure from the African Union. That's a positive step. And we have to applaud that. I certainly applaud that. I think that this is a good step. And us as Africans, when we talk about ensuring that we have democracy and liberalism, all these things that we deem Western, it has nothing to do with the fact that we're embracing Western values. It has to do with the fact that we don't want violence. We don't want people to lose their lives because of political disputes. And that's happened across Africa. This sets a culture of peaceful political transfer, and it will encourage future leaders. Because I have this theory that in any country that's had coups, the coup started with one coup and it became a culture. I mean, you look at Nigeria. The first coup in Nigeria was in the coup in 1966. Then you had another coup that same year. Then you had another coup. Then you had a coup in 76. Then you had a coup in 79. You just had a series of coups that was precipitated by one event. Same thing in Sudan. The first coup in Sudan, you had the coup in 1958 of General Booth. Since then, you had a culture of coups. You had a coup in 64 of Namibia. Then you had a coup of 85. Then you had a coup of 89. Then you had the coup that just recently happened. We need to encourage more cultures of political leaders encouraging peaceful transfer and encouraging nationalism. This is nationalism that I've been defeated, I'll concede, I won't create nonsense. And if you do concede, take it to the courts. Don't let people lose lives because you want to be in power. Take it to the courts. And another interesting fact when I was reading this is that this was the first election solely managed by Liberians without international community funding or assistance since 2003. Since the 2003 Civil War. So the first election that you manage yourself. The first election that you, as a Liberian people, decide who you want. And the person you decided is not the ruling president. And he accepts. And he says, yes, I've conceded. Hats off to you. And this is a positive step because you're seeing what happened, particularly in West Africa, with coups, with violence, with all these things. It's good to see a story where you're seeing a positive democratic transition. It really is. It's reassuring. It's good to see a story. So, good job, Liberia. Good job. I'm proud as an African. I'm very proud. And we need to encourage more. We need to be very clear. People shouldn't lose their lives because people have political differences. Absolutely unacceptable. So, we're going to go to East Africa community. I'm from the East Africa community. So, it's gonna be a fun story to cover because my president of South Sudan has just now been. He's gonna be the chairperson of the community. So on November 24th, the 23rd Ordinary East Africa Heads of State Summit took place in Arusha, Tanzania. It was a 2-day high-profile meeting. Some of the key agendas that they've had was climate change, food security, pollution and waste management. And you see that President Salva Kiir of South Sudan replaced Burundi's President Evariste as the chairperson. I want to talk about regional institutions and how I really have this belief that the African Union is a toothless organization, and if you really want more enhanced Africa cooperation, then you need to work with regional bodies. Why am I saying that? Because you have ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States. You have SADC, South Africa Development Cooperation, and you have the Central African Economic States. Then you have the East Africa Community. These neighboring countries protect each other's interests because chaos in one country affects them directly. And then you have IGAD. We need to add that. It's very important. So for South Sudan, the peace agreement that's currently working in South Sudan was signed through the oversight of IGAD. And most of the IGAD nations include members of the East African Community. The countries that really haven't played an active role in political mediation in South Sudan is Rwanda, Burundi, but Tanzania played a role because in Arusha they had an agreement where they wanted to unify the ruling SPLM, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, which is the ruling party, who splintered, which created the war. Uganda was a guarantor of the peace agreement. Kenya, Ethiopia, Sudan. When you see more regional cooperative bodies working together, this is how we can promote Pan-Africanism on a small scale. Because it's going to be so difficult to promote Pan-Africanism on a continental scale if we don't start within our own homes. Because how can you convince somebody in Liberia to work with somebody in Eritrea or somebody in Ethiopia? They don't know each other. They don't have a boundary. But somebody in South Sudan understands somebody in Uganda. They have borders. They have a lot of mutual interest together. They'll work together. So I like regional bodies. And I think for regional bodies, two issues that they have to focus on: security and economic development. I say security, and what I mean by security is that fighting terrorism, fighting insurgencies, and ensuring that neighboring countries aren't a springboard for rebel movements. And what I mean by that is that if you want to oppose a government, you cannot go to neighboring countries and set up shop. And countries should encourage each other not to support it, because if you're a country and you support rebels fighting a government that's your neighbor, they'll do it to you. They'll do it to you. But if you want to fight terrorism, you have to work together. I think we need to go further. We need enhanced security cooperation, enhanced cooperation between the polices, cooperation between the militaries, between intelligence, and all these sort of things. That's what we need. And I opt for regional cooperation as opposed to continental cooperation. Because in continental cooperation, you can be somebody from Tunisia, and what do you know about somebody in Namibia? You don't. But in Namibia, you're in SADC, you know Malawi. You know Botswana. You know Zambia, Zimbabwe. So regional cooperation is excellent. I love regional cooperation. I want to encourage more regional cooperation. These regional bodies are strong because as somebody who believes in Pan-Africanism and working together as Africans, we have to start somewhere. I'm an East African, I'm a South African, I'm a West African. Then you can come, but you cannot say, hey, I'm just an African. Now, another issue in this is that our president, my president, South Sudan, is going to be the chairperson. This is the first time for South Sudan to be a chair of a regional body since we've gotten our independence. That significance is very important. It's very significant. Let's be honest. I mean, the country got independence in 2011. Civil War broke out in 2013. It joined the Union in 2015. So I think also this is a testament to the fact that South Sudan is no longer a pariah state, because President Salva Kiir is somebody who's already been positioning himself in the region. He has a very good relationship with the president of Ethiopia, very good relationship with the president of Eritrea, very good relationship with the presidents of Kenya and Uganda, and he's currently trying to play a mediating role in the Sudan conflict. He's somebody who has a very good background of negotiation in dealing with insurgency movements. And why do I say that? He was part of insurgency movement from 1983 to 2005. Then he became the vice president of Sudan. Remember, he was a vice president of Sudan, and then he was a president of South Sudan. So he was a vice president of a country. Then when his country succeeded, he became the president of that country. There's a lot that he can offer, and there's a lot of perspectives they can have. One of them is that how can you ensure more integration with these IGAD countries? I see the East Africa community integrating Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Sudan, and Djibouti. I believe they should. They just let Somalia join, which is great. And like I said, President Salva would want Somalia to join, because when their country was joining, South Sudan was joining, the same arguments they made for South Sudan not joining was the same arguments they try to make for Somalia. Instability, insecurity, but still, a brother in need is a brother indeed. How do we work together? And when somebody's dealing with a post-conflict country, they have a lot of perspectives that they can add, because they've been managing chaos for so long that now when there's other countries who are not used to chaos, he knows how to manage it. And number one, for South Sudan, I think a lot of people are ecstatic and happy about this, because it's the first time that South Sudan is head of this union, and it's very important for them. It lifts our head up, and it gives us a lot of enthusiasm. But now, what are some things that I would recommend my president to do? Number one, equality in the EAC. Push for opportunities for South Sudanese. The EAC, opportunities are divided based on the countries. We need to see more South Sudanese playing an active role in the EAC. And I encourage South Sudanese to embrace the EAC. Like I said, I believe in regional integration. The EAC is a great union. We can benefit a lot from the EAC. Try to get the EAC involved more in mediating a lot of some of these political difficulties. Why do I say that? The EAC is an economic body, and is seen more as an economic, customs, cooperation, economic, trade. We want to have a common currency in the future, the East Africa shilling, but you cannot have an economic cooperation without addressing some political differences, without addressing political challenges. Because if Uganda has an issue, it's going to affect trade. That's what I always say. You cannot neglect the security and the political aspects of things when you talk about the economic. Therefore, the political takes priority than the economic. Because if a country is having political differences and political challenges, it cannot progress economically. And you want the region to expand its influence. Like, I would advise that we ensure that Sudan joins, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti. That should be the East African community. Because you have IGAD and you have EAC. I think eventually you should just integrate those. Or have IGAD and EAC have enhanced cooperation. That's what I have to say on that. Many of the times when we talk about Pan-Africanism or we are one people, all this, we feel to neglect that sometimes we're so diverse. We don't know how different we are, but don't know how similar we are. We're different and diverse, but we have a lot of common challenges that we face. And if we work together to address those common challenges, we're not going to have any problems. So these economic challenges, these political unions, these economic unions need to become also enhanced politically. That's what I have to say. We can't talk about the economic without the political. We all know that. You guys all know that. So All right, so we're gonna get to some other stories I want to discuss. So let's go back to West Africa. So Mali just signed a deal with Russia to refine gold. Um, it's gonna process about 200 tons of gold annually. Mali is Africa's largest exporter of gold, and gold is the main export and contributor to the economy. Okay, my thoughts. Well, my thoughts on that is that good step. Many people argue that these countries are working with Russia and as opposed to the West. But hey, first comes first. First, God, what am I trying to say? First comes first serve. And so, basically, when you talk about gold, if a country starts exporting, refining its gold locally, it's value addition. And you have a couple things that you can do. You can just leave the gold there in your central bank, and it can be a reserve currency. Gold can be your dollars. So if you're a country who doesn't have dollars and you produce gold and you refine it and you just put it in your central bank, you strengthen your local currency. Um, so Mali also is a country that just had a coup and is being run by military government. Once again, they got to do what they got to do. But we discussed moving from Liberia, who just had an election, and back to Mali, who has a military government. So with these things, we have to look at, once again, like the theme of all these discussions is that is Africa being exploited? In our modern era, Africa is not being exploited. Africa is looking for people to work with to develop itself. During the colonial era, you had a sort of exploitation where you were treated like a second-class citizen. In Africa, we have free reign. We have something called sovereignty. And we need to embrace that sovereignty. And sovereignty comes with responsibilities, right? So, besides gold, Mali and Russia agreed on constructing a solar power plant with a capacity of 300 megawatts. And it's expected to be operational by 2025. That's big. I mean, if you talk, I mean, these developmental projects are so impactful because, I mean, you're talking about a country where you have electricity usage at 10-15%. Some of these countries have very low electricity usage, access to electricity, let me say. So if you set up a plant and you light up a city or light up a state in there, then you're going to have a lot of changes. So let's think about it like this. Mali is making decisions, working with Russia very closely. You see with Burkina Faso, you see many countries working with Russia, and you see Russia offering a lot. You see China offering a lot. They should work with who they want to work with. Let's call a spade a spade. Who butters your bread is usually the person. And what I'm saying by that is not just to chase money, but also change projects. I mean, you want investments, you want development, you want differences in the standard of living of your people. And to get it, you're going to have to work with who you want to work with. And so we really have to look at that as a token. Like, they want to work with who they want to work with, and they have a right to do that. So that's my take on that. So another story that caught my attention is that Namibia is making a lot of progress in suppressing HIV and AIDS. So there's a story that I read on All African how Namibia is currently working on reducing AIDS. So in Southern Africa, you had these challenges of AIDS. And so if you look at, you can go read about it. It's very interesting. Botswana, Namibia, they've decided to really, they've been cracking down. I wouldn't say cracking down, but HIV AIDS is a challenge in Africa, and it's a stigma to talk about it. And one of the biggest challenges to it is that many people are scared to test and know their status. I'd encourage people to always just test and know your status. It's better, safer for you, your partner, your future kids. It's good. So currently, over 90% of the people living with HIV are aware of their status, and more than 90% of those identified are receiving treatment. That alone, I think, is a big statistic that caught my eye, is that 90% of the people who know they have it, like 90% of the people living with it are aware of their status, meaning that only 10% don't know that they have it. And then of those 90%, 90% of that 90% um, are receiving treatment. I think that's great. That's beautiful. Um, some of the biggest challenge to countering AIDS in Africa has been treatment. I mean, how do you like not treatment? The treatment is after you identify, but how do you get people to accept that they have it? So, some of the things that people spread it, and it's mostly low income people. Low, I wouldn't say low income, but like historically marginalized groups who will have AIDS, not know they have it, and then they will, spread AIDS different ways, needles, sexual transmissions, different things. And so that's a stat that caught my eye, and I think that's very interesting. And I think we need to encourage more testing and more people to know their status. Know your status, test, don't get anybody sick, protect yourself, and also the stigma. We need to reduce the stigma. And this stigma is a big thing. So the global fund has partnered with Namibia to combat HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And since 2004, has distributed almost 372 million to the country. And so I'm glad that they're using that very well. And so the Global Fund Vice President has acknowledged their progress, but also that the goal is by 2030 you want to end AIDS. That's the goal. And so that goal can be achievable. But once again, you really need to tackle this. And some of the things you need to target is stigma. Encourage testing, encourage the stigma. Because when we talk about Africa being great, we really need people healthy. And then you can go to other places. There's a surge. But all in all, let's hope people get healthy. So I think we're at the end of the show. Thank you guys for joining us. If you are on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you are on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please share the podcast and share your ideas. We really appreciate it. Follow us on Twitter, Akol Dok. Share to your people. So until next time, thank you guys.